The tariff trap. How customs duties became America's secret tax on the poor before 1913. Now, before you assume this is just another video about import duties and trade policy, stay with me, because I'm going to show you something that historians have been arguing about for decades but almost never say out loud. The tariff wasn't America's secret tax on the poor. It was actually America's first successful revolution against the rich, and that's precisely why it had to be destroyed. If you've watched any history content about 19th century America, you've probably heard the complaint. Tariffs were regressive taxes that hurt ordinary workers because they made imported goods more expensive. Buy a shirt from Manchester, and you paid more because of tariffs. Buy European steel, pay extra. The narrative is clean, it's intuitive, and it's taught in every economics classroom. But here's what almost no one tells you, and I want you to pay close attention to this because it completely reframes how you understand American power in this period. The tariff wasn't designed to protect the poor from cheap imports. It was designed to protect American industrial workers from being replaced by cheaper foreign labor. And when you understand that distinction, everything else about how America actually became wealthy starts to make sense. In the early 1800s, America was a dependent agrarian economy. We were exporting raw cotton and grain to Europe and importing nearly everything we actually needed to function as a modern society. We didn't make our own textiles. We didn't forge our own iron. We didn't manufacture machinery. We relied entirely on European supply chains, and that made us vulnerable to every single fluctuation in European politics, European wars, and European trade decisions. After the War of 1812, when British ships blockaded American ports and British manufacturers suddenly couldn't sell us anything, something remarkable happened. Americans started making things for themselves. Wait, this part is important. When Congress passed the Tariff Acts of 1828 and beyond, they weren't trying to create a permanent tax burden on American consumers. They were doing something far more radical. They were actively choosing to build a domestic industrial base, even if it meant paying more for goods in the short term. Think about what that actually means. You're a poor farmer in Ohio in 1835. Your family needs cloth. That cloth now costs more because foreign textiles are taxed. Yes, you pay more, but that tariff is also financing the creation of local mills right down the road. It's keeping money circulating in your region instead of flowing to Manchester or Belgium. And more importantly, and this is the part that changes everything, you now have the possibility of leaving the farm and finding work in one of those mills. The tariff created a labor market that didn't exist before, and that labor market, that opportunity to move from agricultural work to factory work, to gain new skills, to earn cash wages instead of subsistence, that was the most valuable thing you could offer to someone living in poverty. This is where the story gets genuinely counterintuitive, and where most popular historians simply drop the ball. The British economic historians, the laissez-faire economists, and the Southern planters all screamed the exact same complaint at Congress. Tariffs are inefficient! They protect uncompetitive industries. They distort natural market signals. And you know what? They were absolutely right. Tariffs were economically inefficient. But America didn't need economic efficiency in the 1830s and 1840s. America needed bargaining power. America needed to become self-sufficient. America needed the political independence that only comes when you're not dependent on foreign supply chains. Henry Clay understood this perfectly. He called it the American system, and he wasn't being coy about it. The tariff wasn't supposed to be permanent. It was supposed to be a bridge, a finite period of protection that would allow American industry to reach the scale and efficiency of British industry. Once we achieved parity, the tariff could theoretically be reduced. But here's where the story takes a darker turn and where I need to give you some actual context that textbooks almost always compress. By the time Congress was debating tariff rates in the 1820s and 1830s, something had already changed in the structure of American power. The industrial North was accumulating capital, mills were generating profits, factory owners were becoming wealthy, and they were reinvesting those profits not just in more factories, but in political influence. They hired lobbyists, they financed newspapers, they built networks with politicians. And once an industry has that kind of entrenched financial power, that bridge protection becomes very difficult to dismantle. Because here's the thing no one wants to admit, in a functioning economy, the tariff protection should have been temporary. It should have worked exactly the way Clay described it. American textile manufacturers should have eventually become efficient enough to compete with British manufacturers without government support. And at that point, tariffs could be gradually reduced. But that never happened. What happened instead was the opposite. As American manufacturers became wealthier and more powerful, they lobbied harder for even higher tariffs. The protective bridge became a permanent wall. If you were a European textile manufacturer in 1850, you looked at America and saw a market completely closed to you. If you were a poor American consumer in 1850, You paid significantly more for every textile product you purchased because domestic competition was severely limited. But if you were a wealthy New England mill owner, the tariff was the greatest wealth creation machine ever devised. The tariff allowed you to charge high prices in a protected domestic market, accumulate massive profits, reinvest those profits into larger and more efficient operations, and then lobby Congress to keep raising tariffs to prevent competition. You basically got to grow your company risk-free. So the real question isn't whether tariffs hurt the poor. Of course they did, in the immediate sense. If you needed cloth and domestic cloth cost 40% more than foreign cloth would have cost, that's real money out of your pocket. The real question is this: compared to what? What was the actual alternative? If America had remained dependent on British manufacturers, there would be no factories in New England. There would be no jobs in those factories. The wealth that those factories generated would have flowed to British owners instead of American owners, and British investors would have controlled American manufacturing capacity. You might have paid less for cloth in 1835, but you would also have had fewer opportunities for employment and less control over your own economic future. This brings me to a much larger and more uncomfortable truth about how the tariff actually functioned in American society, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment because it involves understanding how national power is really built. But first, I need you to see something that almost never appears in mainstream history. The tariff debate in 19th century America wasn't actually a debate between the rich and the poor. It was a three-way struggle between three completely different factions, each with incompatible interests. The northern industrial class wanted high tariffs. The southern plantation class wanted low tariffs because high tariffs made imported goods more expensive for them to buy, and they didn't have domestic manufacturing to protect. And then there were the western farmers, who wanted roads and canals, infrastructure that the federal government could only pay for if it had tariff revenue. But western farmers also wanted cheap imported tools and machinery because that lowered their input costs. So when people say the tariff was a tax on the poor, what they often mean is the tariff was a tax on southern consumers to benefit northern manufacturers. And that's true up to a point, but it was also a tax on southern plantation owners because high tariffs meant the industrial goods they needed to import cost more. And it was a tax that created the possibility of western development because the tariff revenue allowed Congress to fund internal improvements. The tariff was a tool of regional power consolidation, and that's actually where the story gets genuinely important for understanding modern America, because the tariff wasn't just about economics. It was about which region of the country would control the political and economic future of the nation. Between 1828 and 1860, the tariff became the primary mechanism through which the North essentially transferred wealth from the South to northern manufacturers. It wasn't slavery. Slavery was a separate catastrophe entirely, but the tariff was how the North built the capital base that eventually allowed it to win the Civil War and control American development for the next century. That's the secret that most tariff histories avoid. The tariff made America wealthy, but it made the North wealthy, and it did so specifically at the expense of the South. When Southerners called the tariff of 1828 the tariff of abominations, they weren't exaggerating. They understood exactly what was happening. They were being systematically extracted from, and there was no democratic mechanism to stop it because the North controlled Congress. Now, I want to be absolutely clear about something here. The tariff didn't cause slavery, and removing the tariff wouldn't have ended slavery. The South's entire economic model was dependent on enslaved labor, and that's a completely separate moral catastrophe. But the tariff did intensify regional tensions. It made the South economically weaker relative to the North. It gave northern manufacturers the capital to build competing industries and eventually compete for political power. And it created a structural resentment that made eventual conflict more rather than less likely. By the 1850s, the South was looking at a future where it would be permanently outvoted in Congress by a more populous, more industrially developed North. The tariff was just the most visible manifestation of that power imbalance. The real problem was that America was becoming two incompatible economies, one industrial and one agricultural, and the tariff was the mechanism through which one was feeding off the other. This is where most tariff discussions simply end, but I need to take you deeper, because the real story, the part that actually reveals how American power works, is what happened after the Civil War, when the North finally had complete control over tariff policy and no Southern opposition to constrain them. If your theory was that tariffs were supposed to be temporary protection for developing industries, then 1865 would be the perfect moment for them to disappear. The North had won. Northern industry was now dominant. It didn't need protection anymore. Surely, tariffs would be reduced or eliminated. Instead, something completely different happened. After the Civil War, tariff rates went higher than they had ever been before. They stayed high for the next 50 years. Northern industrialists discovered something crucial. Once you have a tariff in place that makes you wealthy, you never voluntarily remove it. You just spend your new wealth buying politicians to keep it in place. And the bigger you get, the more you can spend, and the easier it becomes to maintain indefinite protection. This is what I want to leave you thinking about as we move deeper into this story. The tariff wasn't just an economic policy. It was a mechanism for wealth concentration and political control. And the question of why it eventually had to be destroyed, why the income tax had to replace it as the primary revenue mechanism for the federal government, that's a question that reveals something fundamental about how power actually works in America. I'm going to show you that story in the next section, and it's going to connect everything from the railroad kings to the bankers to the very reason your paycheck has federal taxes taken out of it every single week. If you haven't already subscribed to this channel, this is the moment to do it, because understanding where that paycheck tax came from is going to reframe how you see American history completely. And I'd love to know in the comments, have you ever looked into where your federal income tax actually came from? Or is this the first time you're realizing it's only been around for about a century? Let me know what surprises you. Now, here's where the story gets darker. While the tariff was quietly draining money from ordinary Americans, the men who benefited from it most, the industrial magnates, the railroad barons, the steel kings, were becoming phenomenally, almost impossibly wealthy. And they were doing something with that wealth that would reshape American politics entirely. Take Andrew Carnegie. By the 1890s, Carnegie Steel was producing more tonnage than all of Great Britain combined. And how did Carnegie become the dominant force in American steel? Not through innovation alone. He became dominant because the tariff protected him. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 placed a duty on imported steel that made foreign competition nearly impossible. American steelmakers could charge whatever they wanted because their customers had nowhere else to buy. Carnegie knew this. He understood exactly how the tariff worked in his favor. But here's what most histories get wrong about Carnegie. He didn't just keep the money and move on. He became obsessed with something else entirely. Carnegie started giving away his fortune with a kind of missionary zeal. By the end of his life, he had donated roughly $3.50 million to public libraries, universities, and charitable institutions. He funded over 2.500 libraries across the United States and Britain. And when people asked him why, Carnegie had a sophisticated answer. He believed that a man who dies rich dies disgraced. He believed that the wealthy had a moral obligation to distribute their fortunes for the public good. It sounds noble. It sounds almost enlightened. But there's a mechanism operating beneath that nobility that nobody wants to talk about. Because when Carnegie gave away his fortune, he didn't give it to the government. He didn't say, "Congress, here's my money, use it to fund schools and roads." No, he created foundations. He established boards of trustees. He controlled the flow of his own money, even after he donated it. And here's the critical detail. By donating instead of paying taxes, Carnegie avoided giving that money to the federal government. The tariff had let him accumulate wealth that should have gone to public coffers. Now, his charitable giving allowed him to decide how that wealth would be distributed, not elected representatives. Wait, before we continue, I need you to hold this pattern in your mind for a second, because this mechanism isn't unique to Carnegie. It becomes the template. John D. Rockefeller did something similar. The tariff protected oil monopoly. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled 90% of American oil refining by the 1890s. He accumulated $1.4 billion by the time he was done. And Rockefeller, like Carnegie, began his own philanthropic empire. He created the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913. He funded medical research, public health initiatives, educational institutions. Again, money that the tariff had let him extract from the economy was now being distributed through private institutional channels that he controlled. The same pattern emerged with the railroad kings. The tariff protected American railroad companies. It made imported railroad equipment expensive, which meant American manufacturers had captive markets. James J. Hill, E. H. Harriman, Cornelius Vanderbilt, they all accumulated vast fortunes through a system where the tariff guaranteed them profit margins that no competition could threaten. And they too began establishing trusts, endowments, and charitable institutions with their wealth. But here's what's genuinely important about this moment in American history. By the early 1900s, there were two competing systems of wealth distribution taking shape. On one side, you had the government's tax system, which was primarily dependent on tariff revenue. On the other side, you had the private charitable and institutional system, the foundations, the trusts, the endowments, which were now distributing enormous sums of money that had been extracted from the poor through tariffs, but which bypassed government entirely. This created a profound tension, and the tension had a name: democratic legitimacy. The tariff was supposed to be a tool of Congress. Congress voted on tariff rates. Congress supposedly represented the people. But the charitable system was accountable to no one. When Rockefeller decided how his money would be spent, the American people had no say. They had no vote, they had no representation, the money had been extracted from them through a regressive tax that they couldn't control, and then it was being distributed through institutions that they couldn't influence. And this is where the story connects to something that seems completely unrelated at first: the rise of antitrust sentiment in America. By the 1890s and 1900s, there was growing public fury at the monopolies that the tariff had enabled. Carnegie controlled steel. Rockefeller controlled oil. The railroad barons controlled transportation. These men had become so powerful that they seemed to operate outside the normal rules of democratic accountability. Theodore Roosevelt came into office in 1901, and one of his primary missions was to break up the trusts, to restore competition to American markets. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil to be dismantled. It was broken into 34 separate companies. On the surface, this looked like a victory for the American people against monopoly power. And in some ways it was. But there's a deeper story here about how power actually gets redistributed in American society. When Standard Oil was broken up, Rockefeller didn't lose his wealth. In fact, he made money on the dissolution. His shares in the separate companies became worth more than his shares in the monopoly. Rockefeller remained phenomenally wealthy. But now his wealth was distributed across multiple company holdings rather than concentrated in one. And, this is crucial, his charitable foundation continued to operate exactly as before. The Rockefeller Foundation distributed its money. It established universities. It funded medical research. It shaped public health policy across the entire world. So what had actually changed? The monopoly was broken up. Competition in the market was restored. But the mechanism by which private wealth could be converted into institutional power, that mechanism remained completely intact. In fact, it was about to become far more important than anyone realized. Because by 1910, the tariff system that had built all of this wealth was beginning to face serious challenges. Farmers were angry because the tariff made farm equipment expensive. Workers were angry because the tariff made consumer goods expensive. And there was a growing movement, a genuine popular movement, to reduce tariff rates, to expose the American market to more competition, to break the grip that protection had on the American economy. The Payne-Aldrich tariff of 1909 tried to balance these pressures. It lowered some rates while maintaining protection on key products. But it satisfied almost no one. Progressives thought it didn't go far enough. Protectionists thought it went too far. And beneath all of this political conflict, there was an economic reality that nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. The tariff system was running out of room to operate. The United States had become the world's leading industrial power. By 1910, American manufacturing capacity exceeded that of Britain, Germany, and France combined. American factories didn't need protection anymore. They could compete globally. And American consumers were increasingly being squeezed. The tariff was keeping prices artificially high on everything from clothing to food to machinery. The system that had been designed to protect young American industry had become a mechanism for enriching the industrialists who now dominated that industry. And here's where the story takes a turn that almost nobody understands. The people who benefited most from the tariff weren't actually opposed to changing the system. The industrial magnates understood that the tariff's days were numbered. The political pressure against it was too great. The system was becoming politically unsustainable. So they didn't fight to defend the tariff itself. Instead, they fought for something else. They fought to make sure that whatever system replaced the tariff, it wouldn't include a direct tax on their accumulated wealth. And that, finally, is where the income tax enters the story, not as a triumph of progressive taxation, but as a carefully negotiated settlement between the old guard of industrial wealth and the rising class of progressive reformers who wanted to democratize American taxation. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand what happened when the tariff system finally broke down, and that's a story that involves political miscalculation, economic crisis, and the precise moment when American power got reorganized from the ground up. The election of 1912 was a referendum on the tariff. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate, ran explicitly on a platform of tariff reduction. He called it the New Freedom. He promised to restore competition to American markets, to end the protection that had made monopolies possible, to make American goods cheaper for ordinary people. And the American people, exhausted by high prices and angered by the visible corruption of the tariff system, voted for him. Wilson won with only 42% of the popular vote. The Republican Party had split between Taft and Roosevelt, but he had a clear mandate to dismantle tariff protection. In 1913, with the Underwood Tariff, Wilson began reducing tariff rates significantly. Rates that had stood at 45% under the McKinley tariff were cut to 25%. Entire categories of goods were placed on the free list. For the first time in decades, American markets were being opened to international competition. It was a genuine shift in economic policy. And it worked, at least in economic terms. Competition increased. Consumer prices began to fall. American consumers got access to cheaper goods. But here's the problem that nobody had really thought through. When you cut the tariff, you cut the government's revenue. The tariff had been the federal government's primary source of income for over a century. Roughly 90% of federal revenue came from tariff duties. When those duties were reduced, the federal government suddenly faced a massive budget shortfall. And this is the moment, this precise moment in 1913, when the income tax stopped being a theoretical possibility and became a political necessity. The 16th Amendment, which gave Congress the power to levy an income tax without apportionment, had been ratified in February 1913, just weeks before Wilson took office. And suddenly, with tariff revenue collapsing, the income tax wasn't just an option anymore. It was the only way to keep the federal government functioning. But here's what nobody was saying out loud, and this is the secret I promised you at the beginning of this video. This is the hidden mechanism that explains everything. The tariff and the income tax weren't actually replacing each other in a straightforward economic transition. What was actually happening was a fundamental reorganization of how private wealth was going to be protected in the American system. Under the tariff system, wealth was protected through high prices on imported goods. The tariff let American manufacturers charge whatever they wanted. Consumers paid more, workers paid more, the wealthy accumulated vast fortunes. But the tariff was transparent. Everyone could see what was happening. Congress voted on tariff rates. Newspapers debated them. The system was politically exposed. The income tax was different. It was ostensibly progressive. It was presented as a way to make the wealthy pay their fair share. But it was designed with exemptions, deductions, and corporate loopholes that would allow accumulated wealth to be sheltered from taxation in ways that tariff protection never could. And crucially, and this is the part that's almost never discussed, the income tax system could be managed and adjusted by experts and bureaucrats in ways that the tariff system never could. In other words, the shift from tariff to income tax wasn't a victory for the common person. It was a reorganization of the mechanisms by which the wealthy could be sheltered from bearing the full costs of their economic dominance. The tariff had been an obvious, visible way to transfer money from poor consumers to rich industrialists. The income tax would be a more sophisticated, more bureaucratic, more difficult to understand way of accomplishing something similar, but with the additional advantage that it looked fair, it looked progressive, it looked like the wealthy were finally being made to pay. And the beauty of this system, from the perspective of the wealthy industrialists who understood what was really happening, was that it could be tweaked. Tax rates could be raised or lowered. Deductions could be added or removed. The entire system could be adjusted by people with specialized knowledge, tax lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, who were primarily available to the wealthy. The tariff had been crude. The income tax was elegant. It accomplished the same goal, the transfer of wealth upward, but in a way that maintained the appearance of fairness and progressivism. But here's where the story takes a turn that most economic historians genuinely miss. The income tax didn't actually produce the revenue surge that the government, or the public, expected it to. When the tax went into effect in 1913, the very first year, it brought in only about $2 million. That sounds like a substantial number, until you realize that the tariff system was still generating somewhere between $3.0007 and $4.00 million annually. The income tax was a supplement, not a replacement. It was a layer added on top of the existing extraction mechanism, not a fundamental restructuring of how America financed itself. And that matters because it tells you something crucial about what was actually being built. If the income tax had been designed to genuinely replace tariff revenue, you would have expected the tariff rates to drop proportionally, but they didn't. What happened instead was that both systems operated in parallel, creating what we might call a dual extraction apparatus. The poor and working class continued to pay tariffs on the goods they consumed, food, clothing, fuel, textiles, while a small percentage of the wealthy paid income taxes, which they had the resources and expertise to minimize through deductions, exemptions, and carefully structured financial arrangements. The tariff remained what it had always been, a hidden tax paid in small increments every time someone purchased something, so diffused and normalized that most people didn't even think of it as taxation at all. You didn't get a bill for it, you didn't receive a statement, you simply paid more for your shirt, your sugar, your steel tools, and the government collected the difference between the domestic price and what the tariff artificially inflated it to. And now, in the post-1913 world, that mechanism was still running at full capacity. The income tax was introduced not primarily as a replacement for tariffs, but as a supplement, a way to give the government an additional, more visible source of revenue that could be showcased to the public as evidence of progressive taxation, while the old system continued to work quietly in the background. Before we continue, hold on to this pattern because it becomes absolutely essential to understanding what happened next. When you understand that the income tax was layered on top of tariffs rather than replacing them, you begin to see American fiscal policy not as a series of random reforms, but as a carefully constructed architecture designed to extract wealth from multiple angles simultaneously. The system looked like it was evolving toward fairness when it was actually becoming more sophisticated about concealment. And here's something that rarely makes it into the standard economic textbooks. The very same people who had profited from the tariff system, the railroad magnates, the industrial titans, the banking families, weren't threatened by the income tax at all. Why? Because they had already shifted their wealth. By 1913, the great fortunes weren't primarily held in income-generating assets like wages or salaries. They were held in capital, stocks, bonds, real estate, industrial facilities, mineral rights. The income tax, as initially designed, was a tax on income, not on wealth itself. If you made your money through a salary, you paid income tax. But if your money came from the appreciation of assets or the dividends from corporations you controlled, the taxation was far more favorable, and the deductions available to those with capital were substantially larger than those available to wage earners. This is where the system became genuinely elegant from the perspective of the people who had engineered it. The income tax could be presented to the public as a progressive measure. The wealthy pay at higher rates, the poor pay little or nothing. And that narrative was technically true. But the narrative concealed a far more important reality. The wealthy had structured their financial lives in such a way that they didn't generate much income at all, at least not in the way the tax code defined it. Their wealth accumulated through mechanisms that the income tax touched only lightly or not at all. Consider this specific example. A railroad baron in 1920 who owned a major industrial facility worth $5.0 million didn't pay income tax on that $5.0 million at the point of acquisition. He paid capital gains taxes, if at all, when he eventually sold it. And if the facility generated $5 million in annual profits that he then reinvested rather than withdrew, those profits weren't taxed at the personal income level. They were retained within the corporate structure and taxed at the corporate rate, which by the 1920s was substantially lower than the top individual rate. The wealthiest Americans had mastered the art of moving money through channels that the income tax simply didn't target effectively. Meanwhile, the tariff continued to function as a broad-based, largely hidden tax on consumption. And the combination of these two systems, the visible but escapable income tax and the invisible but inescapable tariff, created what we might call a regressive appearance layered over a regressive reality. It looked progressive because the income tax rates were genuinely higher for the wealthy. It functioned regressively because the actual burden fell disproportionately on those who consumed imported goods and had fewer mechanisms to avoid the tax through sophisticated financial structuring. And this dual system, tariffs and income tax operating in tandem, became the fundamental architecture of American federal finance for the entire 20th century. The tariff would eventually decline in relative importance, particularly after the Second World War, when the United States became a global economic hegemon and could afford to be more open to free trade. But even as tariff rates dropped, the principle underlying the system never fundamentally changed. America continued to finance itself through a combination of visible taxes that allowed for escape through expertise and knowledge, and less visible taxes that were nearly impossible to avoid. The income tax evolved, deductions multiplied, complexity increased, but the basic function remained: provide the appearance of progressive taxation while maintaining mechanisms that allowed wealth to be transferred upward without ever appearing to violate the democratic principle of equality before taxation. This is something that becomes clearer when you step back and look at the actual distribution of tax burden across American society over the course of the 20th century. Despite consistently higher tax rates on the wealthy throughout the 1900s and beyond, the effective tax burden, the percentage of actual income paid in all forms of taxation, remained relatively consistent across income groups. The wealthy paid more in absolute dollars, certainly. But, as a percentage of their income, working-class Americans often paid as much or more when you factored in payroll taxes, excise taxes, tariffs, and state and local levies. The tariff trap never really closed. It simply became more sophisticated. And that sophistication is the real lesson embedded in this history. The people who engineered the income tax weren't trying to replace a bad system with a good one. They were replacing a system that was becoming politically untenable, visible, blamed, contested, with a system that could accomplish the same goal while appearing virtuous and progressive. They preserved the mechanism of upward wealth transfer while fundamentally altering its presentation. In doing so, they created a template that would define American economic policy for generations to come. A template in which the appearance of fairness mattered far more than the reality of distribution. Here is the uncomfortable truth that took me years to fully understand. The tariff system that had dominated American revenue collection for 124 years was not abandoned because it was wrong. It was abandoned because it became too visible. The average American could see the tariff tax in the price of their bread, their cotton, their tools. Every trip to the market was a reminder that they were paying. Every receipt was evidence. And by the early 20th century, that visibility had become politically dangerous. The income tax solved that problem, not because it was more fair, not because it was more progressive. It solved the problem because it was obscured. When you pay income tax, you do not see it in the price of bread. You do not see it on every receipt. You see it once a year, on a document you may not even fully understand, filled with language designed to confuse. The mechanism remained. The wealth continued to flow upward. The system of hidden taxation persisted. But now it wore a different mask. This is the revelation I promised you at the beginning. This is the secret that connects every thread we have traced through this entire story. The transition from tariff to income tax was never truly about changing who paid the tax. It was about changing how they paid it, and more importantly, changing how visible that payment was. The wealthy understood this perfectly. They supported the income tax because they knew, absolutely knew, that it would preserve their position while appearing to undermine it. Look at what happened after 1913. The tariff rates dropped, yes. But did the price of goods drop proportionally? No. The tariff revenue declined, but total federal revenue actually increased. The machinery of redistribution did not slow down. It simply changed shape. It became more efficient, more sophisticated, and crucially more invisible. The average working American thought they were paying less because they were no longer paying the tariff in the grocery store. They did not yet realize they were now paying through their paycheck. The bankers who had engineered this transition understood something fundamental about human psychology and social control. People will tolerate a system they can see and blame. They will rage against it. They will organize against it. They will rebel. But people will accept a system they do not fully understand. A system that is too complex to grasp, too abstract to visualize, too removed from their daily experience. The income tax was that system. It was designed to be incomprehensible. The tax code itself became the mechanism of control. And here is what still haunts me about this history. The people who benefited most from the tariff system, the railroad magnates, the industrial titans, the banking families, they did not lose wealth when the tariff was replaced by the income tax. They repositioned themselves. They hired accountants and lawyers who understood the new system. They exploited its loopholes before those loopholes were even widely known to exist. The system changed its appearance. The actual distribution of burden remained remarkably stable. What happened to the working poor and the middle class was something different entirely. They did not have the expertise to navigate the new system. They did not have the resources to hire the people who did. They were suddenly expected to understand a tax code that was deliberately written to be incomprehensible. They were taxed on income they earned but did not realize was taxable. They paid for a system they could not see, in ways they could not fully articulate, on behalf of a government they could not control. This is the real story of American taxation. Not a story about fairness becoming more progressive. Not a story about the rich finally paying their share. A story about a system being redesigned to accomplish the same goal, the extraction and redistribution of wealth upward, while appearing to accomplish the opposite. The architects of this system were not careless. They were not naive. They were precisely aware of what they were doing. They understood that political power in a democracy requires the appearance of legitimacy, and so they built that appearance into the structure of the tax code itself. The lesson that emerges from this history is one that applies far beyond taxation. Systems do not fail because they become immoral. They fail because they become visible, and the people who control systems understand this. When visibility threatens power, power redesigns itself. It does not surrender. It evolves. It adopts the language of its opponents. It frames itself as the solution to the very problems it created. And then it continues, largely unchanged, wearing a new mask. Here is what you need to carry forward from this story. The next time you hear a politician or economist describe a new tax policy as progressive, ask yourself a hard question. Does this policy actually change who bears the burden, or does it only change how that burden is distributed and how visible it is? Does this policy transfer real wealth, or does it only transfer the perception of fairness? Does it make the mechanism of extraction more transparent or less? Because the history of American taxation teaches us that the most dangerous systems are not those that are openly unjust. They are those that appear just while functioning unjustly. And the architecture of that appearance is often the most important part of the system itself. The tariff trap was not truly a trap because of how it extracted money. It was a trap because it revealed the mechanism. And when that mechanism was revealed, the architects of American wealth had to build a new one. They succeeded. And for over a century now, that new system has functioned so smoothly, so invisibly, that most Americans have forgotten the system even exists. That is not an accident. That is the entire point. Thank you for staying with me through this piece of American history that most people have forgotten, and most textbooks refuse to honestly examine. If you found value in understanding how the hidden machinery of American finance actually works, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell so you never miss a new investigation. And if you have your own experience with how opaque systems obscure their true cost, share it in the comments below, because understanding power requires that we see it clearly, even when it was deliberately designed to remain invisible.